Is the golden age of podcasting over? With new tech and listening habits, 2025 is a pivotal year for podcasting. But don't hit stop recording just yet. I promise this episode, we're going to be talking about the future of podcasting and how you can make sure that you thrive during all of it. Is podcasting dying? The answer is no. But here's what's really happening. So much happened in podcasting in 2024. Let's go through each of these things. It was quite an interesting year for a lot of business owners, a lot of podcasters, content across the board, especially as in the United States, we saw a shift in listener habits in Q4 due to the election as well as holiday seasons. So there's a lot of things that have been going on in 2024, but let's go through each of these. Now, we did see a rise of video podcasts. Last year, we talked about how Google Podcasts was shifting to use YouTube music as well as YouTube videos for podcasts. Now we're seeing Spotify come back with a rebuttal to that, creating a space for creators. Now that nixes out a lot of podcasters because the numbers that you're required to get in order to be part of that collective is actually relatively high. But it's very similar to the YouTube monetization requirements as well. So when we're looking at them side by side, whether you're trying to monetize via YouTube or Spotify, we are seeing those numbers pretty similarly, but it's still higher than the majority of podcasters. And I'm going to say 50 to 75% of podcasters are getting less numbers than that. So if you don't fall into the category that is able to monetize via YouTube or be part of the Spotify for Creators communities, don't be discouraged. It is a-okay. Focus on what are your podcast goals and how can you move forward from there? So we did see a rise in video podcasts. I did want to say it was 2 years ago that I don't think that that's the future of podcasting. I still don't think that it's the future of podcasting with this in mind, but I'm going to talk more about that when I go through my projections for 2025. We also saw short form content being the dominant thing. That was what a lot of people were using to talk about their podcast, to promote it. When we were learning about new podcasts, that was a really big way to learn about them. But a lot of podcasters did not see that turn into more listeners. It was bite-sized content that they could repurpose in different ways, but we didn't see it actually convert into more listeners for people. So keep that in mind as we're kind of looking forward. What happened in 2024 was a lot of this content was getting shared, but it didn't mean more listeners. How can we make the most of that? We're going to talk about that in a second. We also saw an increase in competition around platforms. I don't think that this has a huge impact on podcasters specifically, but I do think that it has an impact on our listeners. And it's more important than ever that we are not just promoting our podcast on one player. We are sharing it wherever people like to listen. Podcast listeners are fickle. They are moody. I get it. You have the player you like to listen on. You have the place that you only want to consume podcasts on. If you're someone who listens on Spotify, but someone shares the Apple Podcast link, you're not going to go out of your way to find it on Spotify. So make sure that where you're directing people is in one of two places. Number one, either your website where they can get to know more about you, listen right there on your website, or you send them to your podcast page that they can listen to via your hosting platform, or they can find their favorite app right there. There are lots of different resources. Your podcast hosting platform should have a page that has that. If you don't have that, please move podcast hosting platforms. At Galati Media, all of our clients use Buzzsprout. We recommend it to all of our clients, and we really love their customer service, their value put on indie podcasters, and how much they support their podcasters is just wonderful. It's also very clean and sleek, and the user experience is beautiful. So highly recommend moving over to Buzzsprout if you do not have a podcast hosting website that you can share with your audience. We also saw a huge rise in AI, as well as AI voiced podcast and AI hosted podcast. Now, this is something that a lot of podcast guests are ranting and raving about right now and are very frustrated with, because when we guest on a podcast, and I say we because I also love to guest on podcasts, when we do that, we want to see another person across from us. We want to be able to be in conversation, to show up as our best selves, and to follow the creativity and the creative inclinations of the podcast host. That doesn't really come through when you're talking to a robot or when you're talking to AI. There can be a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding. And when we're sharing stories, we want to be talking to someone who can empathize with us, who can say, wow, I can understand how you feel about that. I recently guested on a podcast talking about grief, and I shared my story of losing both my mom and my dad within a 5-year span. If I were to have that podcast with an AI host, I don't think I would have felt comfortable enough to really dig into my story. I also don't know that I would share as much. I would feel like I had to give robotic answers or surface level stuff. Whereas with a host, I could go deeper. I could talk with more understanding about grief and what I went through, and the other person could respond in kind. They could respond in a way that was informed, in a way that was relevant to their audience, understood what it was that their audience was looking to gather from the conversation. So I don't like that direction. I also don't think it's going to be the future. I think we're going to win out with human voices, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Let's go through my 2024 projections, and were they hits, were they misses? I don't know. Let's see. Number 1 is that evergreen content reigns supreme. I still agree with this, and I think that this is really relevant, especially with our clients who have guests on. And a lot of these guests we were seeing were authors who were launching books. And so there would be this huge increase in listenership, but there wasn't a steady rise in listeners, which is what we would love to see with our podcast. But because our clients were mostly focused with guests being on their podcast, we didn't see that steady increase in growth. And what I recommend for this is that you focus really heavily on solo episodes, that when people come to your podcast, they have something that they can binge, or to create a playlist or a collection or a mini series within your podcast that's all solo episodes that are evergreen content that your ideal listener can go back and listen to and be a starting point for them to understand you, how you talk, what it is that you're doing, and so much more. The second projection was that video is the future of podcast marketing. I don't know. We definitely saw this increase in that way of marketing, but it did not work at all. I think the reason for this is because as creators, we think that, oh, well, people are on social media and they're going to see my podcast. They're going to be excited about it. They're going to want to listen. They're going to get this bite-sized, digestible piece and they're going to be like, ooh, I want to know more. But let's take a step back and not think about it as creators, and instead think about it as a consumer. When you are on social media and you see someone sharing a snippet of a podcast episode, do you then take action? Do you go and download that episode? Do you go and save it for later? My guess is most likely not, because you're not on social media to be educated. You're not on social media to get new podcast recommendations. That is still not the number one way that new people find you. It's going to be through being a guest on other people's podcasts. It is going to be through friend recommendations. and SEO strategy. Those three are still the top performing ways that people find new podcasts. So while I do still kind of think that video marketing is still good to do, I don't think that it is the future of podcast marketing. I think that we have to find new ways to do this. And so that one I would say was a bit of a miss. Number 3 was bold and thought-provoking content being the win. I still think that this is relevant and I still think that it was really important this year, but I think that a lot of podcasts missed the mark with being really polarizing with their content. And I wish we would have seen more podcasts double down on their values and double down on their content and say, here's where I stand and here's what my values are, to more so align their audience with them or realign their audience with them. So that is one thing that I think was still a hit, but I think we missed it as creators and really getting there with being a bit more polarizing and being more thought-provoking with the types of content that we are creating. Number 4 was that information is abundant and to be selective on where it is that you're getting your information. I don't think we did this well either. I think that there was a lot of distracting things and new ideas and new AI tools. And I think we got really distracted this year. And I don't think we were as selective. Yes, I do think that there was more information than ever, but I think we as podcasters missed the mark on this. I think that prediction was a hit, but we missed it just like the one before. And then finally, that listeners, meaning people over downloads and numbers. I think we did this really well in the beginning of the year. I think that there was a really big focus on that. And I think the second half of the year, there was just a lot going on. The economy has shifted. Politically, a lot of things are shifting. And then you add in just an overall sense of we're on the edge of something big going into 2025. We don't really know what it is, but we can all collectively feel it in some way. And so I think that listeners and keeping our listeners top of mind is something that we have to realign ourselves with going into the new year. That is where I think my 2024 predictions were hits or misses. Don't think we had a lot of misses really, but I think that we as creators missed our opportunities in a lot of these ways. So that's something to consider. Now we're about to go through 5 predictions for 2025. But before we get into that, I want to let you know that I have all of these written down with resources and links to other episodes that are going to support you and help you along your journey in our Podcasting in 2025 guide. Please be sure to download that. The link's in the show notes, or you can go to galatimedia.com/2025. As we go into a new year, this year I think is going to be a year for authenticity and community. Aligning yourself with the right types of listeners, aligning yourself and your values with listeners and creating community around that. So I think number 1, we're going to see a great migration of podcast listeners as well as podcasters. I know this can feel a little frustrating or overwhelming if you've been podcasting for a long time and you're like, well, come on, the industry is still so small. There's only so many of us. There doesn't need to be more of us. I get it. That can feel really frustrating. Please stay tuned for the episode next week. We are going to be talking through how to stand out as an established podcaster in a growing market. So if you're feeling frustrated with that idea, please do not feel frustrated. It is a-okay. I've got you. We're going to get through this together. I've been podcasting since 2018. There have been a lot of shifts and a lot of migrations of podcasters throughout those years. So we've got this. It's going to be all right. But I think we're going to see something very similar to the 2020 boom of podcasters and listeners that we saw with algorithm changes and an increase in censorship on social media. I think that a lot of people who are listeners as well as content creators are going to feel really frustrated, and they're going to want to try to find other ways to express themselves without the immediate lashback of people who do not agree with them. So I think that platforms like Patreon, Substack, podcasting, those are going to be places where people are going to go to align themselves with people who have similar values, and that way they can have more control over their content, over their community, without the algorithm shutting them down or not allowing their audience to see their content. So I think we're going to see a big shift in 2025, a huge number of new podcasts coming out, more impact-driven podcasts, more podcasts by marginalized communities, and so much more. I am excited. I think that it's going to be fantastic to see new voices in this space. I think it's going to be exciting to see new listeners in the space looking for new podcasts to listen to, as well as established ones. So keep going, keep creating content, keep podcasting. I think it's going to be incredible. Number 2 for my 2025 predictions, I think the human voice is going to prevail. Like I said, we're seeing some AI generated content, not just the content, but AI generated voices. That is going to not see very good traction, I don't think. I think that listeners are craving authenticity. They're craving connection. They're craving being prioritized as humans. And I think that as human voices, we are going to be able to really make a big impact on this industry and on podcasting and the content that we're creating. So I don't know if you've heard any of the AI generated voices yet. I know that Amazon has a collection of books that are AI generated voiced. As someone who works in the audio industry, I think it's really interesting to see how terrible these AI generated voices are. They're really difficult to listen to. And I kind of wonder sometimes if it's just because my ears are really sensitive and I can pick things up very well, or if it's just that terrible. So send me a DM and let me know what you think. If you've listened to an AI generated voiced podcast or an AI generated voiced audiobook on Amazon or somewhere else, even listening between audiobooks, they now have on Audible a way that they'll say, stay tuned for another recommendation based on your listening habits. And that voice, I can clearly tell, is AI generated. It is not at all human. And even that, I feel like, is a missed opportunity for Amazon to stand out, but they're really shifting into the AI generated approach. And I think that as humans, we're going to care a lot more about what humans have to say and not what a computer has to say or what AI has to say. Giving real life examples, real raw emotions, digging deep into the human experience and what unites us and our values, that is going to prevail. My third prediction is that strategic guesting and out-of-the-box marketing are going to allow you to promote your podcast in the best possible way. And so I've said this before, but podcast guesting, as we see this growth in the number of podcasts out there, as we see this growth in the number of listeners, being a guest is going to be more important than ever. It is something that I am focusing really heavily on in 2025. If you have a podcast and you're looking to grow your podcast, I highly recommend that you are strategic about this. Personally, my goal, if you want to steal it, please do. Personally, my goal is 12 podcast guesting slots per quarter. So that is my goal, and I'm going to stick with it. That means I'm going to be pitching myself to at least 3 to 4 podcasts per week. It's a lot. I get it. But there are a lot of podcasts out there that speak directly to my audience that I know that I can really impact them in a way that's positive and can make a difference in their podcasting journey. So highly recommend guesting as a way to grow your podcast. Out of the box marketing is going to be more important than ever. As we're seeing new podcasters come into this space, it's going to have to be more than just, hey, we got a new episode. It has to be more. And so here's something that I'm personally doing. This is not a business podcast whatsoever, but I'm launching a new podcast next year talking specifically about the romance reading community space, romance genre, etc. I am a romance reader. I read about 250 books per year. I am heavy in the diverse romance community and encouraging people to read diversely, to diversify their shelves, diversify their reading, and to uplift diverse and marginalized voices. That is something I'm extremely passionate about. And I've been wanting to launch a podcast about it for years now. And I finally said, you know what, I'm doing the thing. So that is something that I'm going to be doing in 2025. I'm very excited about it. And I'm having to find different ways to promote this podcast. Ways that don't just show up as a, hey, new graphic, same graphic every week, new podcast episode. How can I show up different, especially in that industry? So what I'm actually doing, for example, is I have someone who's going to be on the podcast. She calls herself the Weekend Reader, and she creates these incredible weekend, almost like reading retreats in her house every weekend. She's identified that this is something that is refreshing and rejuvenating for her as she goes back into her job on Monday. And in order to show up as her best self throughout the week for her family or her work or her loved ones or her friends, that this is something that is important to her. And so we talked through how to create an at-home reading retreat for yourself. And so I can take that episode and instead of saying, hey, new episode with the Weekend Reader, check it out, I can say, here are 5 things that you can do to create a weekend reading retreat for yourself. Here are 5 things to consider as you create a weekend reading retreat for yourself. And then at the end of that, I can say, hey, do you want to hear more? Check out the full episode, right? So it still reaches people where they are. They can be intrigued, they can be educated, they can be informed. I can then use that as a collaborative post with the guest that they feel excited to share about, right? It's not just something like, hey, new episode. They're excited because they're like, yes, I co-created this episode. I co-created this content. That's my information. Awesome. I'd love to collaborate on that post. I can use that as a collaborative post and then share that with my audience who then is interested in that, who then could go and listen to the full episode. So out of box ways of marketing your podcast. And I know that might feel like, oh no, that's a lot of work. How am I going to do that for every episode? How am I going to do that to be able to show up that way for my audience? Take a deep breath. It's okay. You don't have to do this for past episodes. Maybe you pick 2 episodes per month or even 1 episode per month that you just do something different. You promote it in a different way, then see how it works. If it's working, you might want to consider doing it or hiring someone to support you in changing the way that you're marketing or talking about your podcast. So cut through the noise any way you can because it's going to get noisy. All right, number 4 in my predictions is that video is optional. And repurposing is essential. While a lot of these platforms are pushing video podcasts, I still don't recommend it for everyone. We have a client that is personally struggling with solo episodes on video. When it comes to guest episodes, she's like, yes, I've got it, no problem. But when it comes to her solo episodes, she's like, what do I do with my hands? Where am I looking? What's happening on my face? I don't know how to do this. And I get it. It can feel really frustrating. And if you're not comfortable with video, it can feel really overwhelming. And it can be something that stops you from fully showing up as yourself, which I told her, I said, look, if you are struggling with this, take video out of it. Your message is imperative for your audience. Your audience needs to hear your message. How can you show up as your best self, share this message with your audience? If video is not it, then don't do it for your solo episodes. We still have all your guest episodes on video. That is okay. Do what's going to work best for you. But video is optional. Repurposing is essential. I think the key to success is going to be in reaching your audience where they are. So you might not have someone who listens to podcasts. How can you find them? Maybe that is through a LinkedIn article. Maybe that is through a newsletter to people who subscribe to your email list. Maybe that's through a Patreon or a Substack. Maybe that's educational posts on social media. How can you take that podcast episode, have that podcast be your pillar, and then branch out, right? That's your root. That's the trunk of your tree. And then have the rest of your content branch out from that strong content that you create. One, it's going to help you be way more focused on your social media. You're not going to be creating 50 different things every single week thinking, I have to show up, I have to show up, I have to show up. No, you can just take that one podcast episode and repurpose that into a bunch of different ways. Do that, and that is going to help alleviate the stress of sharing constantly. It's going to alleviate the stress of my listeners are down, but my blog readers are up. Incorporate all those numbers together when you're looking at the data. Make sure that you're looking at what are my YouTube views and what are my listens on my podcast hosting platform. Look across the board to see that growth rather than just saying, well, my podcast listens are down. What about everywhere else? Where are people engaging with your content? How well are those posts doing? Look at all of it. That is going to help you really be able to show up as your best self in 2025. And so for 2025, I think video is going to be optional, but repurposing is going to be absolutely essential. And the fifth one is that impact-driven podcasts are going to be on the rise. I mentioned at the beginning that I think that podcasts that are hosted and are aligned with marginalized communities are going to see a rise. I think that podcasts with a clear focus on impact and on community growth and empowerment are going to be really prominent and are going to be featured in a lot of different ways that when you show up and you share your voice, which has been historically silenced, that this is going to create even deeper conversations with your audience. And so if there is a way that you can double down on marginalized voices, double down on your community and your values, that is going to make a big difference in the growth of your podcast for the future. So creating that sense of belonging, creating that space that is safe for people, that is a place where people feel like they belong and like they are there for a reason. Get clear on that. I think we're going to see a huge rise in those as well. So is your podcast ready for 2025? Here are some things to consider as you're going into it. Some challenges, some opportunities. Number one, reevaluate your podcast's purpose and your audience. 2, refresh your content to prioritize authenticity and connection. 3, be strategic with your podcast guesting and find creative marketing strategies. Number 4, repurpose your podcast content across multiple platforms. And number 5, align your podcast with a meaningful impact or cause, something that's near and dear to your heart that shows people where you stand. Does this excite you? Or does it worry you? I know it excites me. I am so excited about where we're going for the future. Don't forget to download our Podcasting in 2025 guide. That goes through everything that we talked about today and is going to help give you clear direction on where you need to focus your attention. If you have any questions on anything we talked about, please send me a DM or you can send me an email, admin@aliciagalati.com. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. Until next time, happy podcasting.